Warden. James asked me to provide some information on nutrition. We've got several questions, not only in our Facebook group, but it's one of the most common questions that I receive as a coach is regarding race day nutrition. So I'd like to cover a few different topics. One would be the basic review of energy systems use. This may be information that is well understood by many of you, but I'd like to just take a few moments and review that again. Also, I'd like to talk about intake, recommended intake for multiple distances, just some baseline recommendations for different nutrition intake for sprint, Olympic, half, and full Ironman, what to do on race morning, and then what to do with hydration and electrolytes, and then even some in-race nutrition as well, some specific in-race nutrition recommendations also. Now, again, this is if you're an advanced triathlete, a lot of this you could probably skip ahead by 5-10 minutes, but I would want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding some terminology, what kind of substrate systems are used in exercise. Of course, the primary thing to understand is that our bodies for energy primarily are going to use carbohydrates and fat. Some cases where protein is used, but we're going to not cover that. That's under a different type of maybe extreme exercise, but there is a teeny tiny bit of protein that can be used. But in general, your body's going to use carbohydrates and fat. Carbohydrates in the form of glycogen and glucose. Glycogen is stored in your livers and your muscle, and glucose is another name for blood sugar. So if you take a look at a typical, very athletic, lean male, let's say 143 pound male with 12% body fat, that's pretty athletic. That's very healthy. That's a good place to be if you want to be an endurance athlete. That individual could have up to 2,000 calories, maybe just over 2,000 calories of carbohydrates available for the body. But note the amount of fat that even a very lean athlete is going to have. 75,000 calories of fat. And it could be 150,000 calories of fat for an average middle-aged adult. And the point of showing you this is to affirm that you have more than enough energy at any given time to complete 10 or more Ironman. We have tons of fat stored in our systems to be able to use for energy. Now, we always need a little bit of carbohydrates as well, but we have unlimited reserve practically of fat that can be used for endurance training. Now, of course, our bodies use carbohydrates and fat differently at different intensities. So on this chart at the bottom, we have different levels of intensity represented in a percent of VO2 max. As our intensity increases, as we use a higher percentage of our maximum oxygen uptake, our percentage of fat goes down, while our percentage of glycogen goes up. Now, this does not indicate that the amount of fat goes down as our exercise increases. That's not the case. In fact, the total amount of fat oxidation will increase as intensity increases. What this is if you look at the left side of the chart, it's the percentage that's being used. So as our exercise intensity increases, we're going to start to use more and more glycogen. And as our exercise intensity decreases, we're going to use more and more fat, but we'll still use a more and more larger percentage of fat. Our total amount of fat will actually continue to increase until some place just below lactate threshold. The other thing I want you to note is that the crossover point is about somewhere between 50 and 60%. I've got it at 50% here. I've read other research that shows it's more like 60%, where we're using 50% of fat and 50% of carbohydrates. It really doesn't matter where that crossover is, but what does matter is that most of your endurance, Ironman, half Ironman kind of training is going to take place in the 60 to 70 5% range, and then your sprint and Olympic is going to be more in the 70, 80, even 90% range. And so you're going to be burning a lot more glycogen at those higher intensities or those shorter distances, and a lot more fat at your half Ironman and Ironman distances. Some other notes about your energy stores. So 2,500 calories is really virtually the maximum limit that a human body can store. Even a very large male is really only going to get up to about 2,500 calories. It can be low as 1,000 calories in glycogen for females or in very untrained athletes. Females have less muscle mass, and males tend to have more muscle mass. Glycogen can be increased through that muscle mass, through training, increasing carbohydrate consumption or carbo loading prior to a race, or an effective taper. That can all give a temporary boost to your total amount of glycogen. But the goal of every endurance athlete should be to maximize glycogen stores and train your body to burn fat for fuel, because you have that unlimited amount of fat that you can pull from when training or racing. In other words, we have a limited supply of glycogen, but we have an unlimited supply of fat. So this is our precious stores of glycogen, only about 2,000 calories. That's enough, depending on the intensity, for about 3 hours of exercise if you don't take in any additional calories. So the more we can train our bodies to burn fat for fuel instead of glycogen, the less likely we are to run out of this precious carbohydrate resource. Some other notes on energy use. Your body can be trained to use a higher percentage of fat for fuel by spending a lot of your time at long, slow distances. This is part of James' new SOAR program, where you have the right level of intensity. Too much training at high intensity, not only does it interfere with your recovery, but it trains your body to use carbohydrates as opposed to fats when you're racing. This change can happen both at a chemical level as well as the development of some more slow twitch muscle fibers. As the more you train at a long, slow endurance, you can kind of convert some of your swing voter muscle fibers to become slow twitch muscle fibers, and they in turn will burn more fat for fuel. But regardless of your fitness level, doesn't matter how fit you are, glycogen stores are eventually going to run out if you don't replenish them during exercise. For some athletes, it may be at 2 hours. For some, it may be 3. For some, it may be 6 hours before they run out. But everyone will run out of glycogen at some point if they don't, during exercise, if they don't continue to take in some more carbohydrates. And that's what hitting the wall is. When you run out of when you run out of glycogen in your system, you have to stop until your body can get more glycogen. It's possible to convert fat into ATP, which is the chemical used to create muscle contraction, but that is really hard on your body to use fat exclusively. It really needs some carbohydrates in order to be able to do muscle contraction. Here's an example of the same cyclist, kind of a before and after, although the before is on the bottom here and the after. Let's go back. The before is on the bottom chart and the after is here on the top. So before, this is a metabolic test. What we do is we put a mask on an athlete and have them exercise at various intensities, and we measure how much fat they're burning at various intensities. So this athlete, brand new athlete, you can see as his heart rate goes from 116 on this bottom chart all the way up to 150. He starts as his exercise intensity increases, the amount of fat begins to increase, and then it just starts to go down, 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 down until he gets into the about 145 heart rate, and then his fat just collapses because at that point that athlete is hitting kind of a lactate threshold where the amount of fat that's being used is dramatically changed and carbohydrates are needed. Up above is a well-trained cyclist, in this case the same cyclist, after a couple of years of training with me. Not only did he have a much higher amount of kilocalories per minute. Before, his peak was 3 kilocalories per minute of fat at 121. After a couple of years, he was up to over 7, almost 8 kilocalories of fat per minute at a much higher intensity. This is exactly what we want to see in someone who is training for a long distance event. Not only are we burning more fat for fuel, we're burning more fat at higher intensities for longer. In fact, he was still burning over 3 at 155 heart rate, when before he capped out at 3 before he had started training. So this is what, not all of you can do a metabolic test or don't have access to it, but ultimately from training right, which is a lot of your training at slow intensity, about 80% of your training at slow intensity, trains your body to burn more fat for fuel and to burn less carbohydrates, even at relatively high intensities. Now let's talk about nutrition for short events as well. Now I know that most of you are getting into Team IronCowboy because you're into half and you're into full Ironman, and that's great. But there is a place for nutrition in the sprint and Olympic as well. This is a great study that's been duplicated several times regarding the effect of carbohydrates on high intensity for a very short period of time. In this case, we had almost 20 endurance cyclists all doing a 40K time trial. They did this twice. They either drank essentially Gatorade, 7.6% of carbohydrate electrolyte solution, or colored water, a placebo, before they did this 40K time trial. Now, we know that you are not going to ever run out of carbohydrates in a 1-hour time trial. Regardless of your intensity, you have more than enough. Any good athlete, even a very unathletic person, is not going to run out of glycogen in 1 hour of exercise. So why is it then that these cyclists did so much better when they took in carbohydrates versus when they did not. If you look at the bar chart to the right, the group that took in the CE solution, or again, just like Gatorade, was able to do that 40 kilometers about 30 seconds faster, oh no, more than that, I'm sorry, a minute and a half faster than their counterparts who just took in a placebo. So why would that be if carbohydrates are plentiful within the system? And the answer is that it is the glucose, it's the blood sugar that's making the difference. Blood sugar, of course, has a big effect on how you feel, even mentally. When you don't eat and your blood sugar goes down, you start to feel grumpy, you start to feel cranky, you start to feel lethargic. The same thing happens in exercise. If you run out or get low of blood sugar, you don't feel as good. Your body is saying, yeah, something's not right, I'm going to hold back a little bit. So even in those short events, I would recommend taking in 100 to 150 calories per hour of carbohydrates, not to keep your glycogen high, but to keep your glucose high, your blood sugar, the amount of carbohydrates effective in your blood, because that affects your brain and how your body perceives the intensity that's doing. How your body perceives fatigue is significantly impacted from the amount of blood sugar you have. And actually, we can extend this to more than just short distances. Even in a half Ironman or Ironman event, if your blood sugar starts to get low, you will start to feel fatigue more than you really should. Your perception of how tired you are is greater than it actually is if your blood sugar is low. So even if you don't think you need a lot of carbohydrates, you're probably right. You don't need that to finish, but you do need it to keep your mood and your affect high. And so I would still take in at least 100 calories per hour to keep your blood sugar at the right levels. All right, so here's some simplified, approximate energy requirements. Now, if you're an advanced triathlete, you know that making broad nutrition recommendations is somewhat foolhardy, because we know as advanced triathletes that it's different for everyone, right? You have to try multiple types of nutrition, not only the types, but multiple amounts in training and in racing until you kind of find your sweet spot. But these are recommendations that I would propose would be your baseline. If you really have nowhere to go and you've just struggled, or you're a new athlete, this is where I suggest you start your first test in your training or in your racing, and then refine it over continual tracing and continual racing. So for Sprint and Olympic, 100 to 200 calories on the bike. That's primarily to keep your blood sugar high, your glucose high. Marathon. Well, so it's possible on the marathon that you can hit the wall. Even on the Olympic, you could hit the wall and run into glycogen. It's less likely. But on the marathon, when you're getting into a 3, 4, 5 hour event, you're getting to the point where you might hit the wall and run out of glycogen. So about 150 calories per hour will be enough to kind of keep your glycogen stores topped off and to ensure you're not going to run out. And that's not a lot of calories. The odds of you having GI problems or gastrointestinal problems at 150 calories per hour is pretty slim. That's a pretty safe amount that won't cause stomach problems. For a half Ironman, 200 to 300 calories per hour on the bike and about 100 calories per hour on the run. At the half Ironman level, there is a significant risk of hitting the wall if you don't take in some calories. At that point, we're talking about a 5, 6, 7, 8 hour event for some athletes, and not taking in any calories is going to be a high likelihood. Or frankly, even if you only took in a few hundred calories during the entire event, there's a good chance you're going to run out of glycogen and have to stop until you take in more carbohydrates. And then for a full Ironman, 200 to 400 calories per hour on the bike and about 150 per hour on the run. On an Ironman, there are very, very few athletes that can do a full Ironman without taking any carbohydrates. I've met some. It is possible, but their level of fat utilization is off the charts and their genetic abilities are a little bit inhuman. So for the most part, the rest of us mortals need to take in 200 to 400 calories per hour on the bike and about 150 per hour on the run to make sure that we don't hit the wall. Again, 200 to 400 is not, actually 400 is pretty high. That's enough where you might start running into GI issues. 200 is pretty safe. I would start with the low end of that and maybe work your way up. And once you are able to complete your training or complete your Ironman on 250 or 300 calories, I would stick with that and wouldn't necessarily need to increase your calories once you find that sweet spot. So those are some good baseline recommendations on where to start based on different distances for your training on what you should take in per hour. All right, so now that we know maybe what to take in per hour, this is the second question I get about race nutrition is what do I take in race morning? And here's some general guidelines is 2 to 300 calories for each hour before the race begins and no calories in the last hour before your race or warm up. And I'll talk about both of these a little bit further. So for some examples, if you had a 7 a.m. Olympic event, you take in 400 to 600 calories between 5 and 6 a.m. That's your 200 to 300 calories each hour before the race begins. Other recommendations below for a half Ironman, a marathon, and down to an Ironman, that last bullet point, 800 to 1200 calories 3 to 4 hours before the event. This would mean, for a lot of you, would mean actually setting your alarm clock for, let's say, 3 in the morning, having your breakfast, and then going back to bed for a couple more hours, right, before you have to get up and go to transition. You may not be able to actually sleep for those last couple of hours, but that's going to ensure that you are going in to your Ironman event with your glycogen fully capped out. Your glycogen stores at that point should be maxed out, and it should be enough time for it to pass through your stomach, right? If it's 4 hours before your event, most of that's going to be absorbed. You're going to be not have a full stomach. You kind of want to go into an Ironman with not a full stomach, but you do want completely full glycogen stores. And so that little trick of getting up really early, having a whole bunch of calories, going back to bed, gets that right balance between an empty stomach and full glycogen. What should I eat on race morning? I get this all the time. David, what is the silver bullet? What's the magic formula that I need to use on race morning? And the answer is it should be the same thing you ate when training. When you went out and did your long bricks, your weekend 5, 6, 7 hour bricks that you've been doing in your Ironman training, or your 2, 3, 4 hour bricks for your half Ironman training, we would want you to eat the same things on training that you're going to be on race morning. Training, those race simulations, those bricks are not just to practice your intensity, are not just to build fitness. They're to practice all aspects of racing. We should be practicing your nutrition. You should be practicing your equipment. You should be practicing your apparel. You should be practicing where you store your nutrition. There shouldn't be anything new on race day. Race day should be another workout that you have practiced many, many times before, but in a tapered condition. So it's a workout in which you will do your very best. Everything else you've done before in training, including nutrition. And so you should practice that on your long bricks. Semi-liquid is best. Semi-liquid is something that that has low fiber, something that is easily digested. So smoothies, for example, maybe a low fiber smoothie. I like Ensure. That's the drink for the old people. I'm not aging myself there, I hope not, but I like Ensure. It's got pretty low fiber. And porridge, I'm sorry, I put porridge there. I just realized because I last presented this to a group of Russians and they call it porridge. So hot cereal, something like steel cut oats, maybe some buckwheat, some cream of wheat, on the low fiber side if possible, and I'll talk about that in a second, but something that is semi-liquid, easy to digest. All right, so David, I get this question, why no calories in the last hour before exercise? Don't I want to make sure I'm topped off completely? So shouldn't I be eating a ton in the last hour? In addition to having that fill up your stomach more than necessary, the real disadvantage is that for all distances, whether it's sprint or Ironman, is a condition called exercise-induced hypoglycemia. So this chart's a little busy, but once you understand it, it makes you really know how eating carbohydrates can affect your blood sugar. And we talked about how important blood sugar is, right? High blood sugar helps with performance and low blood sugar will reduce your performance. So here we have two types of athletes. The blue baseline had no sugar in the last 45 minutes before exercise. The red line was a group that had a lot of sugar 45 minutes before exercise. So what happens to the red group? We'll start with them. They eat some carbohydrates 45 minutes before exercise. That's that negative 45 with the 0 on the x-axis being the time that they start exercise. So negative 45 is 45 minutes before. Their blood sugar, as you'd expect, goes up and up and up and up, right? That's what happens when you eat carbohydrates. But then what happens is your body's like, whoa, this is, I need to pump out some insulin here because there's too much blood sugar and it's not being used. So the next thing your body naturally does after your blood sugar spikes is it pumps out insulin to combat that blood sugar. Then the blood sugar drastically drops. So the amount of glucose it gets cut basically in half from what it was prior to not eating anything at all. So in fact, we have put you in a worse state, or this red group is in a worse state in terms of glycogen than they were if they hadn't eaten anything at all, because of the body's reaction to taking in sugar in the absence of exercise. But let's take a look at the group that didn't eat in the last 45 minutes. Their blood sugar stayed the same over 45 minutes. We'd expect that. They're not eating anything, so their blood sugar stays stable. When they started to exercise, their blood sugar actually increased, which is also a normal reaction to the body when exercising in the absence of insulin, is your blood sugar actually goes up a little bit. So not only did the blood sugar levels stay much more stable, but time to exhaustion also increased, which is exactly what we want with endurance sports. So the bottom line here is, if you eat within the last, or carbohydrates in the last hour before exercise, you're likely to spike your blood sugar and then have a dramatic drop at the worst possible moment, which is when you start your exercise. Whereas if you don't take anything in the last hour, your blood sugar will remain stable. Okay, we've talked about substrate use, carbohydrates, fats. We've talked about how many calories to have. We've talked about when to eat the calories, when not to eat the calories. The next question is, what should those calories be? How much fat, how much protein, etc. For sprint and Olympic and marathon, I would say 100% carbohydrates. There's benefits to fat, there's benefits to protein, but for sprint, Olympic, and marathon, you just don't need it. Just plain carbohydrates. They are the least likely to cause GI problems. They are easily absorbed, and I just stick with just straight carbohydrates. For your half and full Ironman, this gets a little bit more complicated, actually. I would, on the one hand, I'd recommend 90% carbohydrates and maybe 5% protein and fat. And the reason is that a little bit of fat helps you not feel hungry. A little bit of protein helps you not feel hungry. So many of you may have experienced this before, where you're in an Ironman and you're eating the right amount of calories, but you're starving, all right? You just want to eat so much more. And that fat and protein can help satiate that reaction. And then also, if you're going to do carbohydrates, don't use a single type of saccharide, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. You want, if possible, a variety of gels, a variety of saccharides, and I'll go that in just a minute. There are some disadvantages, though. If you add protein and fat, there are plenty of endurance nutrition formulas out there from Hammer, from EFS, that will give you a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein. But the disadvantage of that is, actually, that's in 2 slides. Okay, so anyway, I'll talk about the disadvantage. I'm getting ahead of myself there. Anyway, let's talk about the type of carbohydrates as well. So even though we're saying, all right, we want this breakdown of maybe 90% carbohydrates, let's discuss different types of carbohydrate fluids: isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. You may have heard these before and had no idea what they meant. This just represents different types of fluids, how they relate to the electrolyte balance in your body. Isotonic means taking in fluids that are consistent with your body's electrolyte balance. A normal sports drink, for example, Gatorade, HEED, will be isotonic. It matches the electrolytes balance in your body. So it's not going to cause an imbalance in your fluids. The reason that we can't drink salt water when we go out to sea is that drinking in salt water, all that salt actually pulls water from our body. It takes more water to process all those electrolytes than necessary. So an isotonic drink is perfectly balanced to be able to not mess with your body's hydration when you're drinking. Hypertonic is just the opposite. It actually has, hypertonic would be like salt water, seawater, or like juice. It has a high level of electrolytes, and it actually requires more water to process those electrolytes, and can cause issues with the GI issues and actually potential dehydration, because you're actually drinking something that requires more fluid to process. And finally, hypotonic, which is something like water or diluted sports drink, where you are going to definitely be increasing your hydration, but you're getting in a lot less carbohydrates and electrolytes. Hypotonic is best for rehydration as opposed to in-race fueling. The reason isotonic is probably the best is that you're getting the amount of carbohydrates you need. Hypotonic is better when you're done with racing, if you need to rehydrate yourself, and that's where you don't need the calories. You just need the fluidness, perhaps. But you don't need to remember all these. All you need to remember in general is that you'll be hard pressed to find a sports drink that isn't a reputable sports drink that isn't isotonic. They're probably all going to be isotonic. The real message here is be careful with your own home brews, right? If you're saying like, okay, I'm going to take my powdered Gatorade or my powdered Heat, I'm going to make this super awesome concentrated formula where I'm going to, instead of doing 2 scoops for 20 ounces, I'm going to do 8 scoops for 20 ounces. Yeah. That can cause problems. You actually could be causing some GI issues or some hydration issues. To further demonstrate that, let's give you an example of a study of 55 half Ironman triathletes who took in, or who had or did not have GI issues, gastrointestinal issues. In the group of 55 half Ironman triathletes, those who took in fat and protein were more likely to vomit or wanted to vomit if you had fat and protein as part of your in-race or pre-race meal. So that's one of the risks of fat and protein. It may help you feel a little bit more satisfied during the Ironman, but you're also more likely to feel sick during the Ironman. Of those who did vomit, either during or after the race, 93% had consumed a hypertonic beverage, meaning some juice or some sort of home concoction they had made themselves. 40% of those who drank a hypertonic beverage and only 11% of those who drank an iso or hypotonic beverage had severe complaints. So 40% who drank a hypertonic had stomach problems. They didn't necessarily throw up, but they had stomach problems. But only 11% of those who drank an iso or hypotonic beverage had severe complaints. So those who stuck to the formula were much less likely to have stomach issues. 4 to 5 individuals with stomach ache had consumed a strongly hypertonic beverage. And finally, all subjects, which is unusual to find in any study, all subjects with intestinal cramps had eaten fiber-rich foods in the pre-race meal, had eaten a meal with big fiber. Only 10% of those without cramps, we're talking stomach cramps, not muscle cramps, had a fiber-rich meal. So one of the ways, it's not necessarily a guarantee, but one of the ways you can reduce GI issues is not necessarily to reduce the amount of calories, but to reduce the type of calories that you're taking in. Reduce fat and protein, reduce hypertonic, reduce fiber-rich foods before the race. That's a way that you can increase your calorie intake without increasing your risk for GI issues, for stomach problems. Let's talk about, you'll remember that I recommended here, carbohydrates should not be represented by a single saccharide. What I mean by that is that there are multiple types of saccharides, different types of sugars. There's glucose, there's sucrose, there's dextrose, there's fructose, maltose, and my favorite, galactose. Each of those different types of saccharides can only be absorbed at a certain rate. One of the things that changes those saccharides is its molecular chain, and the stomach can only absorb a certain amount of a certain type. It only has a certain amount of receptors. I guess I'm not explaining this right. You want to think of it as there are multiple gateways and receptors in your stomach between your stomach and your bloodstream. Those receptors, there's only a certain amount of receptors that are good or can handle sucrose, only a certain amount of receptors that can handle fructose. So if you eat a wide variety of saccharides, you are more likely to be able to absorb them quicker. For example, if you're eating straight sucrose, that can only be absorbed at 360 calories per hour. So if you're trying to target 400 calories per hour in your Ironman, but you're just eating sucrose, your stomach's going to back up, right? You're eating more than your stomach can process. But if you do 2 parts glucose to 1 part sucrose, that can be absorbed at 432 calories per hour. All of a sudden, you're not going to back up your stomach, right? Because your receptors can handle that combination. Or finally, 2 parts glucose, 1 part sucrose, and 1 part fructose can be absorbed at 560 calories per hour, which is huge, by the way. That's pretty massive. So the take home for you on this is really most sports nutrition companies know this. And you can look at ingredients and see its breakdown of fructose, sucrose, and galactose, whatever. But really, the bottom line is this. Make sure that it has multiple saccharides. Whatever you're taking in, make sure it doesn't just have sucrose. It doesn't just have glucose. It has different types so that your body can absorb a lot more calories per hour. Now, for some of you, it doesn't matter. If you are targeting 200 calories per hour, you can just take in spoonfuls of sugar, right? That's sucrose, just nonstop, because you're not going to back up because you're only taking in 200 calories per hour and your body can handle 360. This really only applies if you're trying to push that limit, right? If you really want to take in as many calories as you can, keep your glycogen super high, you need to be aware of how much your body can absorb based on different types of saccharides.
All right, here's a kind of a simplified summary for the type of nutrition. Use an endurance nutrition product specifically designed for long events. That covers your distribution of fats and proteins and low fiber. For the most part, your EFS, your Hammer Nutrition, they understand how this works, and they're going to give you formulas that have this built in. Secondly, have a wide variety of foods if possible, or a wide variety of carbohydrates, if not necessarily a wide variety of saccharides, or a wide variety of different types of carbohydrates as well. This advice is really more for people who want to really do their own type of nutrition and don't like the nutrition provided by the major nutrition providers, don't like the corporate version. They want to use honey. They want to use their own homemade bread. That's great. Just be aware of the consequences of fiber and be aware of the consequences of taking nothing but honey, because your body's going to have to back that kind of stuff up. The cost of heat needs to be reviewed as well. Cost of heat doesn't need to be reviewed. I just recommend it be reviewed. You'll be fine if you skip this part. You'll be just fine if you do not understand the cost of heat when racing. Feel free to skip the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, I think you might find it interesting. So during exercise, your body actually kind of acts like an air conditioning unit. It takes a lot of energy to dissipate heat. It takes a lot of energy to dissipate heat. At least where I live, my cooling bill is much higher than my heating bill. And that may have to do with other factors, but you may find the same thing sometimes, is that it takes a lot. In fact, running your air conditioner in your car takes a lot more gas to dissipate that kind of heat. Your body's the same way. It needs calories to dissipate heat. As it gets hotter and hotter in your exercise environment, you are going to need more and more calories, more and more glycogen to dissipate that heat. It has to move the blood around. It has to get the blood closer to the surface to try and radiate it out. And so this chart gives you an example of the amount of glycogen required in a cool environment or a hot environment. So the amount of, let's say you're exercising for 60 minutes in a cool environment. Well, your muscle glycogen, if you don't take anything in, is going to drop from 100% capped out to 60%. So you're going to go from some 2,000 calories down to some 1,200 calories in glycogen after an hour of exercise if you don't take anything in. This is at pretty high intensity, by the way. If it's hot, it gets even worse. If it's hot, the amount of glycogen you have left after an hour is only 20% compared to 60%. You've got almost only a third, almost 2/3 more glycogen has been lost in hot environment than a cool environment. So the scary thing about this is that you're training for Ironman Arizona, or you're training for Coeur d'Alene for months and months and months, and you're training in your nice basement at 70 degrees, or you're training outside where it's nice and cool, where you live in Minnesota, and you've got this nutrition thing nailed down. You've gone and you've even done metabolic testing. I'm going to need exactly 225 calories per hour to not hit the wall. Then you go to Coeur d'Alene, where it's 100 degrees, and your body's going to use 2 to 3 times the amount of glycogen, which is scary because how do you plan for that? And the answer is, I'm not sure. I think the real answer is this is why I tend to recommend athletes who can push the limit on your calories, because you never know how much you're actually going to need. I know there's a large group of people that says, no, take the minimum amount of calories possible. You don't want to risk GI issues, and they're right. But this chart is what tells me, you know what? If I have to choose between, if I can take in 400 calories per hour on an Ironman, I think I will, because I don't know how the heat is going to be that day, and I don't know how that's going to affect the amount of glycogen that I have. So when you start to feel super tired in the heat, there's plenty of reasons you feel tired in the heat, and I have a whole other presentation on that. But one of the reasons is that you're running out of glycogen 3 times as fast. And so you do have to consider that when you're training and racing, to increase your intake on glycogen a little bit more than you normally would. All right, fine, let's talk about electrolytes and dehydration. Do low electrolytes cause cramps? So I want to make it clear that if you take in electrolytes and you don't get cramps, don't change anything. Keep doing what you're doing. If you used to get cramps and then took in a lot of electrolytes and now you don't get cramps, keep doing it. I don't want to change anything you're doing there. In fact, if you are positive that electrolytes will prevent cramps, just skip the next 10 minutes and don't listen to this next part. But the research does not support that. There is zero research other than the Gatorade Sports Institute that says that electrolytes are linked to cramps. A couple reasons we can look at this and verify that. One is that pickle juice tends to relieve cramps in 3 to 5 athletes in 35 seconds or less. It is impossible for electrolytes to get into your stomach, absorbed by your digestive system, and into your blood in 35 seconds. There is no way that the electrolytes are triggering the reduction in muscle cramps at that point. The theory is that cramps are based on a neurological response. It is a misfire between your brain and your cramps. And the fact that we can get rid of the cramps in most athletes from something like pickle juice or something high in acetic acid is what they think is really triggering that mechanism, indicates that it does not have anything to do with electrolytes. Additionally, researchers have divided crampers into mild, significant, and serious. And looked at how much of their body mass that they lost. Oh, I misspelled mass there. How much body mass they lost. They could not find any link between dehydration and cramping levels when intensity was controlled. So and these are not just isolated studies. These are multiple studies that say we can't find a link between electrolytes and cramps, and we can't find a link between hydration and cramps. Now, I'm not saying don't take electrolytes. I'm not saying don't drink. You need to be hydrated. But if you're looking for a solution to your cramps, you're not going to find it in electrolytes, and you're not going to find it in hydration. And let me further illustrate this. This is a great research of some Ironman triathletes. And this chart's kind of a little busy to read, but in general, we have two groups, those that cramped in an Ironman and those who didn't cramp on the right in an Ironman, and different data points, different statistics, vital statistics on these athletes from the crampers and the non-crampers. What I'd like to point out, I'll let you kind of absorb this sheet. There's two primary things. Well, there's three things I really want to point out. One is that the bottom three rows there represent the electrolytes and the crampers and the non-crampers. There is no statistical difference between those who cramped and those who did not cramp in electrolytes. If you look at the margin of error, it is the same. There's no difference between the two. Where there is a statistical difference is in body mass loss. The crampers were less dehydrated than the non-crampers. Or let me reiterate that. The crampers, or the controls, the non-crampers were more dehydrated than the crampers. We're looking now at this fourth row from the top, body mass loss. Those that cramped lost 3.4%, plus or minus 1.3 of their body mass through fluid loss. Those that did not cramp lost almost 4% of their body mass. And that's outside the margin of error for both of those, meaning you are less likely to cramp if you are more dehydrated. And actually, that's much of a stretch. I'm going to take that back. What it really means is that hydration does not appear to be linked to cramping. And that's supported by this other research on this previous page. And again, I want to emphasize that if you take in electrolytes and it works and you're not cramping, don't change it. Your body can handle a few extra electrolytes. It's not going to, there's no link that it decreases your performance, right? If you feel like taking in tons and tons of water helps produce cramps, great. There's no link that it's going to decrease performance other than some excess body mass, right? That you're going to have a little bit more body mass and weight that you have to work with. All right, so some simplified hydration electrolytes. Essentially, electrolytes in endurance formula drinks and nutrition products are more than enough for 70.3 in Ironman racing. You don't need to add anything. If you're taking in a sports drink, you've got enough electrolytes. Electrolytes are really unnecessary for sprint, Olympic, and marathon racing. You're not going to run out of electrolytes at those distances, and you're frankly not going to even run out of electrolytes at an Ironman distance. The risk and consequence of hyponatremia is far greater than the risk of dehydration. Hyponatremia is a condition where you take in too much water and it causes swelling of the brain and death. In fact, I'd like to give you a challenge. I want you to try and find how many people have died in a marathon or Ironman event from dehydration versus how many people have died from hyponatremia or drinking in too much fluid. You will find 0 people that have died from dehydration in an Ironman or marathon, and you will find many, many people who have died from hyponatremia. Your risk goes up much higher from drinking too much than drinking too little. Performance, I'm not so sure about. I'm not as definitive on performance as to what happens if you are dehydrated in your performance. So don't drink because of cramping, or don't drink because you're worried about dehydration. Drink because you think it might reduce your performance. Finally, the best time to drink is just drink when thirsty, consistent with your training and the weather. I would never set a goal of how much to drink per hour. I just don't think those are a good idea to say I'm going to drink 40 fluid ounces per hour. That is my goal. There's just no need for that. Just drink when you're thirsty. Separate your carbohydrates from your fluids as much as possible, so you're taking in your carbohydrates independent of your fluids, so you don't have to take in fluids to drink your carbohydrates. And your body really can only take in a maximum of about 350 and 500 milliliters per hour when you're running and cycling anyway, before your stomach starts to back up. It's another cause of GI problems, is actually drinking too much, because your body can't absorb more than about those amounts during those sports. All right, I'm off the soapbox on electrolytes and hydration. Again, no harm in taking them in. Okay, finally, I think this is the last slide, is everything I've provided you here. Oh, not everything. Some things are just rock solid for everybody. Everything else is on a bell curve, meaning you may respond totally differently than anybody else. You may be part of this 2% outlier where, for some reason, electrolytes are linked to cramps. Even though science has not found any link yet, you might be the missing link that says, yes, your body responds to electrolytes and reduces cramps different than everybody else, right? Your body might respond to fats and proteins and fiber different than other people. So I've probably given, I don't know, let's say I've given 30 different points for you to consider on nutrition. Of those 30 different points, only maybe 25 of those are going to apply to you, and the other 6, you're going to be an outlier. And that's normal. We're all outliers in a whole bunch of different genetic and physiological attributes. So everything I've told you, use as a baseline. I'd say use as a general recommendation. If you try it and it doesn't work, then let's mix it up and change it a little bit. All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Hope you enjoyed this. Final bit of advice is that all nutrition amounts, types, and timing should be practiced regularly when training. I kind of did a soapbox on that earlier. Don't do anything new on race day. It should have been something that you tried in training before, or a previous race, maybe a C race, a race you didn't care about. If you practice then, you should be able to nail your nutrition for your A race. Hey, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you being a member of Team Iron Cowboy. Talk to you again soon.